Hey guys, so in this tutorial we are going to go over how Voxify works. Now it was actually called Voxelizer, but Voxelizer was used, so now it sounds like a Harry Potter magic trick, but that's okay. Voxify is a tool which allows you to voxelize any mesh with color transfer, assembly animation, static mesh generation, and so many other features. Now, before we get started, if you can't afford Voxify, just email me and I will send it to you for free. The paid version is just there to help me with my work. Okay, so let's get started. Now, the first thing you want to do after downloading Voxify is to bring it into your project. The way you can do that is by going to File, Append, locate the downloaded file, open it, go to Collections, and then append this Voxify collection. Now I'm not going to do that because I already have it here. It's going to be this Voxify and Voxify Blue collection. And it's going to give us this empty mesh which doesn't have anything inside of it, but in the modifiers tab, it's going to have this Voxify geometry nodes modifier. Now I'm going to duplicate this empty mesh and bring it into my collection. I'm also going to call it Voxify Fern. Now, before we voxelize anything, it is important to note that the scale of your model must make sense. For example, you can select your model, hit N, go to Item, and here you can see all my scales are applied. You can apply them by hitting Ctrl A and applying scales. You can also apply rotation, but that doesn't really matter that much. It is good to do though. Now, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the size of your object. It must make sense. You do not want a fern that is the size of a building, for example. But if you do have a building, if you do have, for example, a 1,000-meter tall skyscraper, in the Voxify fern, or your object, in the voxel size, you want to make sure the voxel size is set to something high, for example, 1 meter for something that is very large. If you do not do this, if you don't set the voxel size for the skyscraper to 1 meter, it is going to generate millions of voxels and possibly freeze your blender. So again, just make sure the voxel size makes sense compared to the size of your object. Now that we know it does make sense, 0.05 means every 5 centimeter is going to be a voxel, we can voxelize our object. Now I'm going to click this eyedropper button and I'm going to select my fern object. And as you can see, right off the bat, it has voxelized the fern. Now to transfer the colors, we can scroll down to the color section and select our base color map. It's also important to note that you need only one material with baked textures. Again, you can't have multiple materials on, for example, this fern for every leaf, or you can't have, for example, a material for wood, a material for metals, and expect it to transfer all those materials. You want a single baked texture for the entire object you are trying to voxelize. Now to transfer other attributes or other maps such as roughness or metallic, we can come down to this extra attributes, enable it, and we can simply select, for example, our roughness. We have something called RGB plus A transfer, which basically transfers all the R, G, B, and A channels of this map that we are selecting, or we could hit multi-channel and select a different map for each channel. For example, for red, we can select roughness, for green, we can select metallic, and in the shader editor, in the materials, you can see these attributes can be separated into colors. Now this is XYZ, you can separate color and simply separate all the channels into red, green, and blue, and the alpha is going to be this one. And you can also just simply change the name of the attributes based on whatever you like. Another thing to mention, here at the top we have something called UV name, which is referencing UV map with capital UV and M. This is the name of the UV map being used by this fern. You can see in the UV maps tab, we have a UV map called UV map with capital UV and M, and I'm using the exact same name because we are basically transferring the UVs into our object. Now these attributes are baked, but what we can do is that we can copy this name, take a duplicate of this attribute node, and we can use the same UV map, and as you can see, I have the UV map of this fern transferred to my voxelized fern. Now I can, for example, use the texture. Let's do image texture. And here select our base color, and you can see it's going to be the same colors that we are transferring here. See, both of them are going to be exactly the same. Now it is actually simpler and more optimized to just sample this attribute rather than reading entire textures with UVs. But it is good to know that we are transferring the UVs into attributes as well. Now, again, let's check out this UV map. You can see we have some problems. Some of these voxels are black and they are basically not getting the correct data. What we can do to fix them is here we have something called interpolate UVs, and if we enable this, it's going to make perfect UVs on the entire object. Now let me reconnect this, and you can see we have our perfect fern. And also let's set this store to single texture to transfer our roughness. Now let's go up here. Again, with voxel size, we can change the size of the voxels. For example, if I set this to 0.1, it's going to be larger, and if I set it to 0.01, it is going to be much smaller. Now here on this object, we have some transparent areas. To mask these transparent areas, we can simply head to the prune section and here enable mask with texture, and we could also select our opacity map. And as you can see, it has masked the transparent areas of the fern. Now, we have something called viewport as and render as. These are basically suggesting that the viewport shows either voxels or point clouds. If I were to show you, point clouds are going to be these round balls. The reason you can see colors are different is because I'm using different settings for this voxel material, but they are basically the same things, except point clouds are round and much more optimized to work with. So we could set our viewport, for example, to point clouds for optimization. Now here we have also something called custom voxel. It is going to use a 0.5 by 0.5 meter Lego brick or whatever object that you want as the instance instead of voxels. For example, I have this Lego brick that is 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter, and you can see it is now instancing that Lego brick instead of simple cubic voxels. We could also just select anything. For example, we could select the fern itself, and it's going to be a fern made of little ferns. Then we have the voxelized panel. It is where the actual voxelization is taking place. We have two methods of generation. One is exact and the other one is fast. Fast is obviously going to be faster. Now, it is more of an artistic choice rather than which one is going to generate the best results. So keep that in mind. For fast, we have something called filled ? To keep the insides. Now we'll later discuss why we would want to keep the insides, but for now let's keep it turned off. We have bandwidth, which you can experiment with to see which one is going to suit your needs. Now on exact, we have something called bound margin, which is right now set to 0.02. It is going to make sure the voxel generated is not cutting any part of the mesh. It's basically like an error threshold. In Fast, we also have this, but it's only going to be enabled with Filled. Now, this object doesn't have a volume, so Filled is not going to work on it. Then, in the prune section, we could decide whether to prune the object or not. Pruning is going to carve out a more accurate shape. We have two methods of carving, one is raycast and one is distance. With distance, you may be able to keep more voxels where you need them to be. With raycast, it is going to be a bit more accurate. Then we have prune tolerance, which is normally set to the same size as your voxel size up here, but you could also choose custom to enter a custom value. Now, in most cases, you're not going to use this. Then we have insides, whether to bypass it, just use it as it is, call the insides to remove the insides, or basically any point or voxel that is underneath the back face of the meshes, or keeping the insides, which again we will discuss why we would want to keep the insides. If I enable call in, you can see it is going to remove any point that is under the mesh or under the back face of the mesh. It's going to help with creating more accurate shapes, or for example optimizing a complex object. For now, let's bypass this. We discussed color and we discussed extra attributes, and that is it for the simple voxelization of any mesh. And now we are going to talk more about assembly animation, generating a static mesh, and fixed animations. Let me disable this collection, go to Prepper, and go to this camera angle. Now here we have this Prepper, and if we go to the viewport, we can see by default it has two walls of voxels. So in the prune section, I can enable call in to remove the unnecessary voxels generated inside the Prepper, because they are not even visible in our render. You can see it's not going to make any difference. Here, you can see the same exact Prepper with called inside. You can see it's going to generate only one single wall of voxels. This one, instead, is keeping the insides. And it has kept all the insides, and if we cut it in half, it's going to have the insides. Now, why would we want to keep the insides? Is for accurate mesh generation. If here, for example, I enable generate a static mesh, it's going to generate a static mesh for us, and as you can see, it's not going to be voxels anymore, and it's going to be a perfect static mesh. However, as you can see right now, let's go to viewport, is going to make it so that it has two walls of a static mesh, and we do not want this. We want the inside wall to be removed. In order to do this, we have to introduce a volume into our Prepper. So in order to do that, we could just keep the insides to give the entire Prepper some volume. Now, if we enable generate a static mesh right now, you can see it is going to have only one single wall of mesh, and it's going to be a perfect static mesh generation like this one. And if we apply this, we can come here, cut this by half, and as you can see, we have perfect static mesh generation. Now, some points on this may still be visible. For example, these points, even though we had the volume, are not removed. So in order to remove these points, we could just hit L on our entire mesh, hit Ctrl I, and then X, delete all the vertices, and now it is going to be a perfect static mesh. When keeping the insides of the object, we also have an option called distance tolerance. For objects such as this tree, or for example the fern that we were voxelizing, they are not going to have any volume under the leaves. And basically they are going to keep all the points in voxels which are under the leaves. So in order to fix this, we could select, for example, a distance tolerance. 0 means infinite. You can see it's going to generate some really bad results, and we are not going to like this. So we could use a distance tolerance of, for example, 0.15, which is going to be the thickest area or the thickest volume of the mesh we are trying to voxelize. In this case, it's going to be this trunk here, and it is going to give the mesh its volume, except it's not going to generate voxels in unwanted areas. Now, if I generate a static mesh on this tree, you can see not only it is faster and more optimized to work with, I haven't even applied the modifier yet, it is just much faster and easier to work with. It's also, if I apply this, you can see it is going to be a perfect static mesh. And again, to remove the unwanted areas that some complex shapes may be creating, we could select the entire tree, hit Ctrl I, and X delete vertices to remove all the unwanted islands that it has generated. And that is it for static mesh generation. Now let's discuss fixed animations. Here you can see I have this ball which is animated. It has a very simple class simulation to it with some pressure. And on the first frame, if you notice, since the pressure is very high, it is going to expand a little bit. And with this version that we have here, I am voxelizing this exact animated ball. So on each frame, it is going to be voxelized again and again. You can see how it's going to look. With this version, however, the object I am voxelizing is the same exact ball. For example, I can show it to you. This is the static ball that I am voxelizing. It is the same exact ball. You can see both of them are using this cube mesh. One of them has cached class simulation inside of it, and the other one doesn't have it. So in this version, I am using this static ball, and down here I have enabled fixed animation, and the animated object, I am selecting my animated ball. And as you can see, I'm not sure if we could call this voxel art anymore. However, it is going to hold its shape, hold the shape of each little voxel as it was first generated. However, since the ball we are voxelizing is very small compared to this one, which has pressure inside of it and has basically expanded, it is going to create this gap between each voxel. So to fix these gaps that have been generated, we could also enable generate a static mesh so that it has the voxels. However, since it's a static mesh, it is not going to generate those gaps between each voxels or between the instances anymore. As you can see, again, it's not going to be perfect voxel art. The voxels are even bending a little bit, but it's working much better. Now, this fixed animation is perfect with characters, for example. Characters, even animated ones, are not expanding or compressing that much. So you could use this fixed animation so that it doesn't voxelize on each frame of its animation. Okay, so now that we have discussed generating a static mesh and fixed animation, we can now discuss assembly animations. If I enable this, you can see I have this anim factor, and if I change it, for example, to 0.4, is going to change the assembly of our animation. Now we could animate this anim factor. We could go to frame 1, set it to 0, hit I to animate it on the first frame, and we can go to the frame 240 to the last frame, set it to 1, and animate it again. However, as you can see right now, it is going to be very slow to animate. And the reason it is very slow is because on each frame, or for example, each time I change a single value in the assembly animation, everything behind it is also being recompiled and recalculated. So in order to fix this and make the animation much faster and almost real time, what we can do is we can bake everything that we are not changing anymore. For example, we are not changing the voxelization, we are not changing the voxel size, colors, or anything like that. So what we can do, we can come here, after instancing and viewport selection, we can come here, select the boolean and input it to the boolean, select the geometry and input it to geometry, and output them to the same nodes. And now I can bake a still frame, and if I do this, you can see now the animation is happening almost in real time. I mean, it is actually real time, not almost. So again, we have this anim factor, which if we change, it is going to change the assembly animation. Then we have something called a speed scale, which if I increase this, it is going to increase the speed of each voxel from its starting point to its destination point. So they are basically going to be less in the space, and they are going to reach their destination faster, and obviously they are going to produce much more intense motion blur. For example, putting this to 250, you can see the voxels are much less in this space because they have already reached their destination before being animated or viewed in the viewport. Let's set this back to 30. And as you can see, we have this problem, which the bonsai is being assembled almost layer by layer. And we do not want this. We may want some randomness. And we have an option for it. For example, setting this to 0.02, it is going to break the pattern and it is going to randomize our assembly. And right now, if you notice, the assembly is happening from a single point in a space. What if we want it to happen from a larger area? We could enable disk distribution. And basically what this is going to do is that it's going to project the entire bonsai onto a simple disk. And if we change this radius to, for example, 0.5 or actually 0.1 maybe, you can see the disk is going to change its initial size, the initial size that the bonsai is being projected onto. So let's set this back to 1, and we could also change its location. For example, if I move it here, you can see that the bonsai is being generated to the nearest area of this disk, and that nearest area is going to be this part. So let's also set this back to 0. Then we have something called a scale and a start location. A scale is the scale after the bonsai has been projected onto the disk. For example, if I set this to 1, you can see it's going to be much larger. And then we have a start location, which is simply the location which the assembly will start. You can see how it is changing the assembly and where it starts and where it ends. And we obviously have the height. Let's set this back to 0, and let's set this to 1.2 for now. Now, the problem with this type of voxelization right now, if you notice, this branch here is being assembled even though it is in the middle of the space. It is not connected to anything by anything, and yet it is being assembled. So what we can do to fix this is that we could use progressive assembly animation and if I enable this, you can see I can bake this again, and now it is using progressive assembly animation, and it's going to first make the trunk, then start working on the branches. Let's also set this randomness that we have here to 0, and let's the randomness of the progression setting to 0.5. It is also important to note that if you are baking a still frame after instancing, each time you change something in the progression setting, you have to bake again. As you can see now, the bake has taken place, and it is going to be a more random progressive assembly animation. It is a bit harder to debug this progression setting though. For example, we have iterations, selection, Z-mask, progression, size, and all of this. And how do we exactly debug this? In order to debug these values, we can come here in the progressive assembly. We have this progressive factor. If we hit tab on it, let's go inside. And here, in order to debug the selection, I can go to viewport, hold Ctrl Shift and left click on this group input, again hold Ctrl Shift on this menu switch, and as you can see, we are seeing our selection. The selection is the white area. We have two different types of selection. One is index, which is going to select a random index. And as you can see, I can change the index sample, and it is very unlikely that we are getting an index that is under the bonsai, because we want the animation to start from the very bottom of this bonsai. So instead, we could use the Z mask. The Z mask is going to create a mask in the Z axis of your object. And if I change this, for example, to -0.1, you can see the selection will be completely gone. But if I change this to 0.01, it's going to select only the bottom of the pot. We also have something called progression size and iterations. In order to debug these two values, we can come here, hold Ctrl Shift left click on this store named attributes, and then again hold Ctrl Shift left click on this named attribute, which is point progress. Now, as you can see, it is going to show us or visualize this sort of gradient that is starting from the bottom of the pot, and it is going to end on our last branches. Now the iteration is not perfect right now, as you can see, some of our branches are staying unprogressed. The progression size needs to be almost more than a half of your voxel size. So right now, our voxel size is 0.005. A half of 0.005 is 0.0025. So now this progression size is 0.0075. And this progression size is going to make sure, for example, that 2 points that are very close to each other are being progressed to. If I set this to 0.005, you can see not only we have more unprogressed areas, but we also have some patches left out. To fix these patches, we have to make sure we are selecting a progression size that is first not too large, because we don't want to progress, for example, 4 points at the same time. We want to progress as little as possible. So we could, for example, select 0.008 to make sure not only we do not have any patches, but we are not also progressing or basically stepping too often or too large. Then we have something called iterations. Iterations is going to make sure that the entire bonsai is being progressed through. and it is very hard to make this automatic. It has to be inputted by hand. So iterations, for example, we could just experiment with it. 180, 190, and as you can see right now, the entire bonsai has been progressed to. Now we can see this point that we have here is pretty black. However, it is progressed to only the progression value is very low. In order to make sure that we do not have any unprogressed areas, we can enable this cleanup unprogressed. And as you can see, this point is staying where it is and is not being deleted. Cleanup unprogressed is going to make sure that, for example, if we have a floating branch here that has nothing to do with our starting point or our selection, and it has not been progressed onto, is going to be removed, and so that it will not be suddenly shown up in the last frame of our animation. For example, you can see this cleanup on progress. If I disable this and let's set this to 100, half of the bonsai is unprogressed, right? So if we enable cleanup unprogressed, it is going to remove that half of the tree that has been unprogressed. However, we do not want to do that. We want to just set the iteration to something larger, or if we can, set the progression size to something larger to make sure every point, as many as possible, have been progressed through, and not delete anything as much as possible. However, sometimes in complex objects, you may have floating points that no matter what you do are not going to be progressed to, and you do not want to sacrifice your progression size, so you can just enable cleanup unprogressed. And you can see how easy it is to debug these progression settings. Now we can delete this, hit tab, now move back to our bake still animation, bake again, and as you can see, we have a perfect assembly animation which is also progressive and is going to progress the entire tree perfectly. One other thing that is worth mentioning is that if you want motion blur, not only you have to enable it in the render view, but also you have to come here at the end of the node tree, and here we have this blue frame called bake animation before render. Simply drag and drop this here and bake animation. This is going to be very fast because again we baked a still frame here, so nothing before it is being baked again, only this part is being baked into an animation. Now if I play this, you can see it's going to play perfectly and the animation is going to work perfectly as well. And that's it for the entire Voxify modifier. Now, excuse my stutters. I'm not a good teacher, and I'm definitely not good at making videos. I have probably recorded this video over hundreds of times by now. It's the 6th day of trying to make this video, and again, I'm not the best teacher. I tried writing it and it didn't work because I want you to have all the information. I don't want to just say, hey, this voxelizes it. Well, it's obvious that it voxelizes the object, but why do we have to keep the insights? Why do we have the assembly animation, and how do we, for example, debug the progression setting? These are things that I wanted to make sure to tell you because it matters a lot when working with such a tool. And I didn't want to just give you some simple information. We do have a fast tutorial, and in the fast tutorial it's like 1 minute. I just give all the obvious information, and it's for someone intermediate just trying to see how things work. But if you are a beginner, usually people who are beginners work with these types of tools, and again, I wanted you to have all the information I could have given you. Surely it may be a bit complex. Sorry if it is. If you have any questions, anything, any feature requests even, just ask me. I will do my best to answer them. Now I'm having some problem with the internet. It's actually been 3 months since I've been connected, which sucks. But enough about me. Again, I'm not the best teacher. I wanted to explain everything in case you are a beginner and you don't have any experience with, I don't know, these types of modifiers and how to debug them and how to make sure everything works. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I will do my best to answer them as soon as I can. Thank you for watching and see you on the next one.